In the late 1930s, when the world was slowly sliding toward another global war, many of Germany's military leaders looked across the Atlantic and saw a country they believed was unlikely to matter on the battlefield. The United States appeared distant, politically divided, and largely uninterested in European conflicts. From Berlin, it looked like a nation rich in resources but poor in military strength, a country that preferred business deals and consumer goods to tanks and artillery. At the time, this belief was not entirely irrational. The United States Army in 1939 ranked only around 17th in the world in terms of size. It had fewer than 200,000 active soldiers, smaller than the armies of countries like Romania and Portugal. Much of its equipment was outdated. Many American tanks were experimental or obsolete, and the Army still relied heavily on horse-drawn logistics in certain units. To observers in Europe, this hardly looked like the foundation of a future superpower. German intelligence reports repeatedly noted the weakness of the American military establishment. The United States had no large standing army capable of fighting a major continental war. Its defense spending was modest compared to the rapidly expanding military budgets of Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler himself often dismissed the United States as a nation of mixed races that lacked the discipline and unity required for sustained war. But numbers on paper can hide deeper realities. In the 1930s, American society was still shaped by the trauma of the First World War. More than 100,000 Americans had died in that conflict, and the public had little appetite for another European war. Across the country, isolationism had become one of the strongest political forces in national life. Organizations like the America First Committee argued that the United States should avoid foreign wars entirely. In Congress, neutrality acts were passed to prevent the country from being drawn into overseas conflicts. To observers in Europe, these developments seemed to confirm their assumptions. The United States, they believed, would remain on the sidelines while Europe fought its next war. Even if America sympathized with Britain or France, German leaders believed political pressure at home would prevent the United States from intervening directly. At first glance, the evidence appeared convincing. In 1939, the U.S. military was scattered across a vast continent, with only a handful of divisions fully trained for modern combat. Large-scale exercises were rare, and many American officers had never commanded troops in a modern mechanized environment. The country lacked the massive armored formations that Germany had developed under its doctrine of blitzkrieg. There were no giant tank armies ready to sweep across battlefields. In Berlin, these facts reinforced a growing sense of confidence. German generals had spent years rebuilding the Wehrmacht into one of the most formidable military forces in the world. They had tested their tactics in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Their factories were producing advanced aircraft, artillery, and armored vehicles at an accelerating pace. Compared to this rapidly expanding war machine, the United States looked slow, bureaucratic, and militarily unprepared. But what many observers failed to fully appreciate was the difference between a military that was small and a nation that lacked the ability to build one. America's armed forces may have been modest in size, but behind them stood the largest industrial economy on Earth. By the late 1930s, the United States was producing more steel, more oil, and more manufactured goods than any other country in the world. Its automobile factories alone were capable of building millions of vehicles every year. Detroit's assembly lines were among the most efficient production systems ever created. Yet to many German analysts, this industrial strength did not immediately translate into military power. American factories were producing cars, refrigerators, radios, and farm equipment, not tanks or bombers. From the perspective of a military planner in Europe, it was easy to underestimate how quickly civilian industries could be converted into weapons production. There was also a cultural misunderstanding at play. German leaders often saw American society. In the late 1930s, when the world was slowly sliding toward another global war, Many of Germany's military leaders looked across the Atlantic and saw a country they believed was unlikely to matter on the battlefield. The United States appeared distant, politically divided, and largely uninterested in European conflicts. From Berlin, it looked like a nation rich in resources but poor in military strength, a country that preferred business deals and consumer goods to tanks and artillery. At the time, this belief was not entirely irrational. The United States Army in 1939 ranked only around 17th in the world in terms of size. It had fewer than 200,000 active soldiers, smaller than the armies of countries like Romania and Portugal. Much of its equipment was outdated. Many American tanks were experimental or obsolete, and the Army still relied heavily on horse-drawn logistics in certain units. To observers in Europe, this hardly looked like the foundation of a future superpower. German intelligence reports repeatedly noted the weakness of the American military establishment. The United States had no large standing army capable of fighting a major continental war. Its defense spending was modest compared to the rapidly expanding military budgets of Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler himself often dismissed the United States as a nation of mixed races that lacked the discipline and unity required for sustained war. But numbers on paper can hide deeper realities. In the 1930s, American society was still shaped by the trauma of the First World War. More than 100,000 Americans had died in that conflict, and the public had little appetite for another European war. Across the country, isolationism had become one of the strongest political forces in national life. Organizations like the America First Committee argued that the United States should avoid foreign wars entirely. In Congress, neutrality acts were passed to prevent the country from being drawn into overseas conflicts. To observers in Europe, these developments seemed to confirm their assumptions. The United States, they believed, would remain on the sidelines while Europe fought its next war. Even if America sympathized with Britain or France, German leaders believed political pressure at home would prevent the United States from intervening directly. At first glance, the evidence appeared convincing. In 1939, the U.S. military was scattered across a vast continent, with only a handful of divisions fully trained for modern combat. Large-scale exercises were rare, and many American officers had never commanded troops in a modern mechanized environment. The country lacked the massive armored formations that Germany had developed under its doctrine of blitzkrieg. There were no giant tank armies ready to sweep across battlefields. In Berlin, these facts reinforced a growing sense of confidence. German generals had spent years rebuilding the Wehrmacht into one of the most formidable military forces in the world. They had tested their tactics in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Their factories were producing advanced aircraft, artillery, and armored vehicles at an accelerating pace. Compared to this rapidly expanding war machine, the United States looked slow, bureaucratic, and militarily unprepared. But what many observers failed to fully appreciate was the difference between a military that was small and a nation that lacked the ability to build one. America's armed forces may have been modest in size, but behind them stood the largest industrial economy on Earth. By the late 1930s, the United States was producing more steel, more oil, and more manufactured goods than any other country in the world. Its automobile factories alone were capable of building millions of vehicles every year. Detroit's assembly lines were among the most efficient production systems ever created. Yet to many German analysts, this industrial strength did not immediately translate into military power. American factories were producing cars, refrigerators, radios, and farm equipment, not tanks or bombers. From the perspective of a military planner in Europe, it was easy to underestimate how quickly civilian industries could be converted into weapons production. There was also a cultural misunderstanding at play. German leaders often saw American society as undisciplined and fragmented. The United States was a democracy filled with political debates, competing interests, and constant public argument. Compared to the rigid authoritarian system of Nazi Germany, it looked chaotic and inefficient. But beneath that surface chaos existed something that authoritarian regimes often struggled to measure: flexibility. American companies were accustomed to adapting rapidly to market demands. Factories were designed to shift production quickly when new products became profitable. Engineers were constantly experimenting with new manufacturing techniques. When demand increased, production lines expanded. When technology improved, entire industries transformed themselves within a few years. This adaptability was invisible in peacetime military statistics. German intelligence officers studying the United States could count soldiers and tanks, but it was far harder to measure the latent capacity of a continental economy. They saw a small army and concluded the nation itself was weak. What they were actually looking at was a country that had simply chosen not to mobilize yet. There were a few individuals within Germany who suspected this might be a dangerous assumption. Some military observers who visited the United States in the late 1930s began to notice things that did not fit the official narrative. They saw rail networks. When German military officers and observers began traveling to the United States in the years before the Second World War, most of them arrived with the same assumptions they had formed in Berlin. America, in their minds, was a country that lived far from the realities of European conflict. It was wealthy, certainly, but wealth did not necessarily translate into military power. The United States had a small army, a public deeply skeptical of foreign wars, and a government that seemed reluctant to engage in global struggles. Many German officers expected to see a comfortable, peaceful country that had little understanding of modern warfare. What they encountered instead was something far more complicated. These visits were not unusual for the time. In the 1930s, military observers from many countries traveled abroad to study technology, logistics, and industrial organization. Germany, despite its growing political tensions with the Western world, still maintained various diplomatic and economic contacts with the United States. German engineers, businessmen, and military representatives occasionally toured American industrial facilities, attended exhibitions, and studied production methods. At first, many of these visitors were impressed simply by the scale of what they saw. American cities were enormous compared to most of Europe. Factories stretched across entire city blocks. Railroads connected nearly every corner of the continent, moving goods with a speed and efficiency that surprised foreign observers. The United States had spent decades building infrastructure designed for a vast domestic economy, and by the late 1930s, it was operating at a level few countries could match. But the real shock came when German observers stepped inside the factories themselves. In cities like Detroit, the heart of the American automobile industry, assembly lines moved with almost hypnotic precision. At companies such as Ford and General Motors, production lines were designed to manufacture cars in staggering quantities. Workers performed specialized tasks while vehicles moved steadily past them on conveyors. The system had been refined over years of experimentation and efficiency improvements. To an outside observer, the most striking feature was not just the number of workers, but the speed of production. A new car could roll off the line every few minutes. Entire factories were organized around the idea that complex machines could be built quickly, reliably, and in enormous numbers. For German officers trained in traditional European manufacturing systems, this was an eye-opening experience. In much of Europe, heavy industry still relied on slower production methods and smaller batch manufacturing. German factories were highly skilled and technologically advanced, but they were not always designed for the kind of mass production that American companies had perfected. The American system prioritized scale and speed in ways that few European industries had fully embraced. Some visitors began asking an unsettling question. If these factories could produce millions of automobiles every year, what would happen if they were converted to build military vehicles instead? A car factory, after all, already contained many of the tools needed to build trucks, armored vehicles, and engines. Assembly lines could be modified, machine tools could be adapted,
Skilled workers could be retrained. The transformation would not happen overnight, but the underlying capacity was clearly there. And the scale was staggering. By the late 1930s, the United States was producing several million cars annually. No other country in the world came close to matching that output. The industrial infrastructure required to support this production included steel mills, rubber suppliers, engine manufacturers, and vast transportation networks. Each part of the system fed into the others. German observers also noticed the transportation system that connected these industries. Freight trains crossed the country constantly, carrying coal, iron, oil, and manufactured goods between cities and ports. American railroads operated on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the world. Thousands of locomotives moved cargo across distances that would have crossed multiple countries in Europe. Grain from the Midwest, oil from Texas, steel from Pennsylvania, and machinery from the industrial North all flowed through this network. For a military strategist, such infrastructure meant something very specific: logistics. Modern warfare depended on the ability to move enormous quantities of supplies quickly and reliably. Tanks required fuel and spare parts. Aircraft consumed huge amounts of gasoline and ammunition. Armies needed food, uniforms, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Without efficient transportation systems, even the strongest army could collapse under the weight of its own needs. The American system seemed almost built for this purpose. Then there was oil. In Europe, oil was one of the most critical strategic resources and one of the most limited. Germany possessed very little natural petroleum and relied heavily on synthetic fuel production and imported supplies. Securing reliable oil sources was already becoming a central concern for German planners. In the United States, however, the situation was completely different. Visitors to Texas and Oklahoma saw oil fields that appeared almost endless. Pump jacks rose from the ground across wide landscapes, extracting petroleum that would fuel automobiles, airplanes, and industrial machinery. The United States was already the largest oil producer in the world, and its reserves seemed vast compared to the limited resources available in Europe. To a few careful observers, this combination of factors began to form a troubling picture. America might not have a large army yet. Its military forces might still be relatively small and poorly equipped compared to the major powers of Europe. But the foundations for something much larger already existed. If the United States ever decided to mobilize its industry for war, it would possess advantages that few countries could match. Some German visitors began quietly writing reports about what they had seen. These reports described factories capable of producing machines at incredible speed. They mentioned transportation networks that could move equipment across an entire continent. They noted the vast reserves of oil and raw materials that would sustain industrial production during a prolonged conflict. The conclusion that slowly emerged from these observations was simple but unsettling. In a short war, Germany might still hold the advantage. Its army was highly trained, experienced, and already prepared for rapid offensives. In such a strategy, the long-term industrial strength of distant nations seemed less important. Yet for those who had walked through the enormous American factories, watched the endless freight trains moving across the landscape, and seen the scale of the country's natural resources, a different realization was beginning to take shape. They were looking at a sleeping giant, and they were beginning to suspect that if that giant ever truly awakened, the balance of power in the world might shift in ways that Germany could not control.
By the time several German observers had traveled across parts of the United States in the late 1930s, a pattern was beginning to emerge in their reports. At first, many had simply been impressed by the size of American cities and the wealth of its industries. But the longer they looked, the more they began to understand that what they were seeing was not just prosperity, it was capacity, a level of industrial potential that had almost no equal in the world. The realization did not come all at once.
It came through a series of observations, each one adding another piece to a much larger picture. In the industrial cities of the American Midwest and Northeast, steel production dominated entire regions. Massive steel mills in places like Pittsburgh operated day and night, transforming iron ore and coal into the metal that powered modern civilization. Huge furnaces glowed through the darkness, while molten steel poured into molds that would later become beams, rails, engines, and machinery. Steel was not simply another industrial product. In modern warfare, steel meant tanks, artillery, ships, and armored vehicles. It meant the skeleton of every military machine that moved across a battlefield. The country that could produce the most steel possessed a fundamental advantage in any long conflict. And the United States was producing more steel than any other nation on Earth. German officers who studied these industries quickly realized that the scale was difficult to comprehend. American steel mills were not just large, they were integrated into a national system that connected mines, railroads, factories, and ports. Iron ore from the Great Lakes region could travel by ship to steel plants, then be turned into finished products and transported across the country by rail within days. The efficiency of this system was something few European countries could match. Another revelation came from the American aircraft industry. During the late 1930s, the United States was already home to a number of rapidly growing aviation companies. Firms like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed were producing civilian airliners and military aircraft in increasing numbers. Their factories were filled with engineers experimenting with new designs, new engines, and new production techniques. At first glance, the aircraft industry was still relatively small compared to what it would become during the war. But the factories themselves were designed with expansion in mind. Production lines could grow, assembly halls could be extended, entire plants were built with the expectation that demand might suddenly increase. This ability to expand quickly was one of the most important features of American industry. Many European factories were older and constrained by space, infrastructure, or outdated layouts. American plants, by contrast, often occupied enormous areas of land. Their owners assumed that growth was inevitable, and they designed their facilities accordingly. When production needed to increase, additional assembly lines could often be installed with surprising speed. German observers also paid attention to the shipyards along the American coasts. Shipbuilding had long been a major industry in the United States, and large yards operated in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and on the West Coast. Cargo ships, passenger liners, and naval vessels were already being constructed in significant numbers. For a country separated from Europe and Asia by vast oceans, ships were the backbone of international power. They carried goods, soldiers, and weapons across thousands of miles of water. Without a strong merchant fleet and shipbuilding industry, it would be impossible to project military force across the Atlantic or Pacific. What some German analysts began to notice was that the American shipbuilding industry had enormous untapped potential. The workforce was experienced, the docks were extensive, the supply chains that delivered steel, engines, and equipment to the shipyards were already well established. In a major war, those shipyards could expand rapidly. But perhaps the most important element of American power was something even more basic: energy. Modern industrial warfare consumes staggering amounts of fuel. Tanks burn gasoline or diesel. Aircraft devour aviation fuel at incredible rates. Naval fleets require constant supplies of oil to operate across long distances. Without reliable access to fuel, even the most powerful army can quickly grind to a halt. In this area, the United States possessed an advantage that was almost impossible to ignore. American oil production dwarfed that of most other nations. Vast fields in Texas, Oklahoma, and California pumped millions of barrels of oil every year. Refineries processed this crude into gasoline, diesel, lubricants, and aviation fuel.
Pipelines and railroads carried these products to factories, ports, and cities across the country. For Germany, the situation was very different. Germany had limited natural oil reserves and relied heavily on synthetic fuel created from coal. This process was technologically impressive but expensive and limited in scale. German planners were already aware that access to oil could become a critical vulnerability in a prolonged conflict. When some observers compared Germany's fuel situation to the immense petroleum production of the United States, the contrast was stark. One nation struggled to secure enough fuel for its growing military. The other produced so much oil that it powered millions of civilian automobiles without difficulty. As these observations accumulated, a broader understanding began to form. War in the 20th century was no longer decided only by battlefield tactics or the courage of soldiers. It was increasingly determined by industrial systems, by factories that could produce thousands of machines, by railroads that could move supplies across continents, and by energy resources that could sustain armies for years. When viewed from this perspective, the United States appeared very different from the weak military power described in earlier intelligence reports. It was more accurate to think of America as a vast industrial engine that had not yet been switched into wartime mode. The factories were already there, the workers were already trained, the transportation networks were already operating. The raw materials flowed from mines, farms, and oil fields into an industrial system that had been expanding for decades. All that was missing was the political decision to mobilize it. For German observers who had seen this system close up, the implications were difficult to ignore. If the United States ever entered a total war and directed its industries towards military production, the scale of that effort could become overwhelming. A nation that could produce millions of automobiles every year might eventually produce hundreds of thousands of military vehicles. Steel mills that already led the world in output could feed the construction of fleets of tanks and warships. Aircraft factories designed for expansion could fill the skies with bombers and fighters. The real danger was not immediate. In the short term, Germany still possessed advantages in military organization, experience, and readiness. Its armed forces had trained intensely for modern mechanized warfare. Its generals had developed new tactics designed to defeat enemies quickly and decisively. But if the war lasted long enough, those advantages might begin to fade. Because across the Atlantic Ocean stood a country with an industrial capacity so vast that once fully mobilized, it could change the balance of the entire war. And a few German officers who had walked through those factories and shipyards were beginning to understand that they had just seen the blueprint of a war machine that did not yet exist, but could be created faster than anyone in Europe expected.
As reports from German observers began to circulate within military and industrial circles in Germany, a quiet tension started to grow between two very different interpretations of what the United States represented. On one side were officers, economists, and analysts who had seen American industry firsthand and believed its potential was dangerously underestimated. On the other side stood political leaders and ideologues who believed that Germany's military power, combined with speed and bold strategy, would make those concerns irrelevant. The reports themselves were often detailed and surprisingly cautious. German visitors who had toured American factories and industrial centers described enormous production facilities, vast transportation networks, and an economy that seemed capable of expanding output at remarkable speed. They noted the immense reserves of oil and raw materials, the scale of American steel production, and the efficiency of assembly line manufacturing that could produce machines in numbers rarely seen in Europe. Some of these reports contained a clear warning. If the United States were ever drawn fully into a major war and committed its industrial capacity to military production, it would become one of the most powerful war-making economies in history. Its factories could produce equipment on a scale that few nations would be able to match. Over time, this industrial advantage could overwhelm even highly trained armies.
But these warnings did not always receive the attention they deserved. Inside Nazi Germany, strategic thinking was increasingly shaped not only by military calculations, but also by political ideology. Adolf Hitler believed strongly in the superiority of Germany's military system and in the idea that decisive wars could be won quickly through bold action. His vision of modern conflict centered on rapid campaigns that destroyed opponents before they had time to mobilize their full resources. This belief formed the foundation of what the world would later call blitzkrieg. The concept was simple but powerful. Instead of fighting long wars of attrition like those seen during the First World War, Germany would launch fast, concentrated offensives using tanks, aircraft, and highly mobile infantry. Enemy defenses would collapse under the speed and coordination of these attacks. Entire countries could be defeated in a matter of weeks rather than years. In such a strategy, time was everything. If Germany could defeat its enemies quickly, their economic strength would never fully come into play. Industrial capacity mattered far less in a short war than in a long one. A nation that mobilized slowly would not have time to convert its factories or train large armies before the fighting was already over. From this perspective, the industrial power of the United States appeared less threatening. Many German leaders believed that America was simply too slow, too politically divided, and too geographically distant to intervene decisively in European affairs before Germany had already secured victory on the continent. Even if the United States eventually entered the conflict, they believed it would arrive too late to change the outcome. There were also cultural and ideological biases that shaped these judgments. Nazi racial ideology viewed the United States as a nation weakened by diversity and democracy. Propaganda often portrayed American society as chaotic and decadent, lacking the unity and discipline that authoritarian regimes claimed to possess. This worldview made it easier for some German leaders to dismiss warnings about American strength. Economic realities were sometimes overshadowed by ideological certainty. Within the German military establishment, however, not everyone was comfortable ignoring the implications of American industrial capacity. Some officers understood that modern wars increasingly depended on production and logistics as much as battlefield tactics. They had studied the lessons of the First World War, when industrial output and resource access played decisive roles in determining which nations could continue fighting. These officers worried that Germany might be entering a conflict whose economic foundations were far less secure than they appeared. Germany had rebuilt its military rapidly during the 1930s, but this expansion placed enormous pressure on its economy. It lacked many essential raw materials, including oil, rubber, and certain metals. To compensate, Germany invested heavily in synthetic substitutes and complex supply arrangements with other nations. While these solutions allowed rearmament to continue, they also created vulnerabilities. A long war would require constant supplies of fuel, steel, ammunition, vehicles, and replacement equipment. If Germany faced opponents with larger industrial bases and easier access to resources, maintaining the pace of production could become increasingly difficult over time. Yet within the highest levels of decision-making, confidence in Germany's strategy remained strong. Early military successes reinforced this confidence. When Germany launched its campaigns in Europe at the beginning of the war, the results seemed to confirm the effectiveness of blitzkrieg. Poland collapsed within weeks. Denmark and Norway were quickly occupied. Then, in 1940, one of the most dramatic military victories in modern history unfolded when German forces defeated France in just 6 weeks. To many observers in Berlin, these victories appeared to validate the belief that speed and operational brilliance could overcome larger economic systems. If powerful European nations could fall so quickly, why should the distant industrial capacity of the United States matter? But beneath the excitement of these victories, the warnings from earlier reports did not disappear completely. Some German planners continued to consider what might happen if the war expanded beyond Europe and lasted far longer than originally expected. They understood that industrial wars follow a different logic than short campaigns. Armies suffer losses, tanks are destroyed, Aircraft are shot down, ships are sunk, weapons wear out. In a prolonged conflict, every destroyed machine must be replaced, often faster than the enemy can replace his own losses. The side that can build more equipment, transport more supplies, and sustain production for longer periods gradually gains an advantage that becomes impossible to ignore. In this kind of war, factories can become just as important as armies. Still, by the early years of the Second World War, Germany's leadership largely continued to believe that decisive victories would prevent such a long struggle from developing. The strategy remained focused on rapid offensives and bold gambles designed to knock enemies out of the war before their full strength could be mobilized. The industrial giant across the Atlantic remained a distant concern. For the moment, the United States had not yet entered the conflict. Its factories were still producing mostly civilian goods. Its military forces were still expanding slowly. To many German leaders, it seemed that events in Europe would be decided long before American industry could reshape the battlefield. Yet the quiet warnings written by those who had walked through American factories and studied the scale of its resources still lingered in the background. They had seen something that statistics alone could not fully capture, a system capable of growing, adapting, and producing on a scale that few countries had ever attempted. And if the war continued long enough for that system to fully awaken, the balance of power might shift in ways that no strategy, no matter how bold, could easily overcome.
For several years, the warnings about American industrial power remained largely theoretical. German strategists could debate reports, study statistics, and argue about long-term possibilities, but until the United States actually entered the war, the full scale of its potential remained uncertain. The factories were there, the resources existed, and the transportation network stretched across the continent, yet the giant had not fully awakened. That changed dramatically after the United States was drawn into the global conflict. Once the decision for total mobilization was made, the transformation of American industry began at a speed that surprised even those who had predicted it. Factories that had once produced refrigerators, automobiles, and farm equipment began converting their assembly lines to build military vehicles, aircraft engines, artillery, and ammunition. Entire industries reorganized themselves for war production. The scale of this mobilization was unlike anything the world had seen before. Automobile plants that once built civilian cars shifted toward manufacturing trucks, tanks, and armored vehicles. Detroit, already famous as the center of American car production, rapidly became one of the most important engines of military manufacturing. Assembly lines that had perfected the art of producing millions of automobiles now applied the same methods to building the machines of war. Workers who had spent years assembling car engines and transmissions now produced engines for tanks and aircraft. Conveyor belts carried the steel frames of military vehicles where civilian sedans had once rolled past. The same industrial logic that had filled American highways with cars was now filling battlefields with armored vehicles. Aircraft production expanded even more dramatically. At the beginning of the war, the United States produced only a few thousand aircraft per year. Within a short time, that number began climbing rapidly as new factories were constructed and existing plants expanded their operations. Massive assembly halls appeared where bombers and fighters moved through production lines, much like automobiles. New workers poured into these factories from every corner of the country. Farmers, mechanics, engineers, and technicians all became part of the growing war industry. Training programs taught thousands of new employees how to operate complex machinery and build precision components. Production continued day and night, with shifts rotating around the clock. The results were astonishing. Aircraft began leaving factories in numbers that few nations had imagined possible.
Bombers, fighters, transport planes, and reconnaissance aircraft rolled off assembly lines and headed toward airfields across the country before being shipped to battlefronts around the world. Shipbuilding followed a similar pattern. American shipyards expanded rapidly to meet the demands of a global war that required enormous fleets. Cargo vessels were needed to carry supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Naval warships were required to escort convoys, protect sea lanes, and challenge enemy fleets. To accelerate production, new shipbuilding techniques were introduced that allowed vessels to be constructed far faster than before. Instead of building ships slowly over long periods, some yards adopted assembly methods that broke the construction process into specialized stages. Sections of ships could be built simultaneously and then welded together, dramatically reducing the time required to complete each vessel. Cargo ships that might once have taken many months to build could now be completed in a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, steel mills increased output to feed the growing demand for metal. Oil production surged to fuel armies, aircraft, and fleets operating across two vast oceans. Freight trains carried raw materials to factories and finished equipment to ports with relentless efficiency. The enormous transportation network that German observers had noticed years earlier now functioned as the circulatory system of a global war effort. As this industrial mobilization accelerated, the consequences began appearing on battlefields. American trucks carried Allied soldiers across deserts, mountains, and forests. Tanks built in American factories joined armored divisions, pushing through enemy defenses. Aircraft produced by the thousands filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific, escorting bombers, attacking supply lines, and supporting ground troops. In the air war over Germany, the scale of American production became impossible to ignore. Massive formations of bombers crossed the skies, escorted by fighters that extended the reach of Allied air power deep into occupied territory. Factories, rail yards, and industrial centers found themselves under constant pressure from an air campaign sustained by a seemingly endless supply of aircraft. For German soldiers and officers, the machines appearing on the battlefield began to feel strangely familiar. Some of them remembered earlier visits to the United States before the war, when they had walked through the factories of Detroit or watched freight trains move endlessly across the American landscape. At the time, those observations had seemed distant possibilities, industrial potential that might one day matter if events took a certain path. Now, that potential had become reality. Columns of Allied vehicles stretched across roads and supply routes. Trucks delivered ammunition and fuel in quantities that kept entire armies moving forward. Replacement aircraft appeared quickly even after heavy losses. Destroyed tanks were replaced by new ones arriving from factories thousands of miles away. The industrial system that had once produced consumer goods for a peaceful economy had been transformed into a machine capable of sustaining war on a global scale. For Germany, this created a problem that grew larger with every passing year. German industry continued to produce weapons and equipment, and German engineers developed remarkable technologies under increasingly difficult conditions. But the country's limited resources and constant pressure from Allied bombing campaigns made it difficult to match the growing output of the combined Allied economies. Every tank lost in battle had to be replaced by a new one from the factory. Every aircraft shot down meant a new one from the factory. Every ship sunk meant another vessel had to take its place. Over time, the ability to replace these losses became one of the most decisive factors in the war. And in that competition of production and resources, the United States possessed an advantage that few nations could overcome. What some German observers had glimpsed years earlier during their visits to American industry was now fully visible to the world. The quiet factories they had toured, The railroads they had watched and the oil fields they had studied had all become parts of a vast war machine. The sleeping giant had awakened. And as the war moved toward its final years, many within Germany could see that the conflict had become something far larger than a series of battles or campaigns. It had become a struggle between industrial systems, economies, and resources on a global scale. In that kind of war, the nation that could build the most machines, move the most supplies, and sustain production the longest would eventually shape the outcome. Years earlier, a few visitors had already sensed this possibility while walking through American factories. Now, as the skies filled with bombers and the ground shook under the weight of advancing armored columns, that possibility had become an undeniable reality.